All right, well, welcome. Tonight we are going to be getting into a new study here. We are studying ecclesiology, or the history of the church, and we're going to be looking at the first several hundred years of Christianity and really just the Christian church and kind of examining what that looked like. All right, so church history. This is one of my favorite topics. It's something that I think really tends to be pretty neglected in sort of the modern church today. People, I don't think very well of church history. They don't think very much of church history as a whole. So, this is one of the reasons why we teach that. Is we want to understand and appreciate the way that God has worked through human history. There's a number of great value or areas of value, I guess I could say, in studying church history. One of the things is just church history is incredibly important as we battle and resist teaching that is false. We live in a day where there is much information that's out there, but many times the information is just not accurate. Just curious, how many, by show of hands, have heard that the Trinity was invented in the 4th century by Constantine? Anybody? Only one? You guys must not spend much time on the internet. Okay, how about at the Council of Nicaea, the church voted on which books would be in the Bible? Ooh, got a couple there. All right, cool. So these are things that can be, if you're a new Christian or you're not familiar with the history of that, if you hear those kind of things on YouTube or blogs or whatever, that can be quite faith rattling to hear some of these things. Many of the apologetic challenges of our day stem from the roots of our faith being attacked, and many times that's done through attacking the church, attacking things that have been taught or done in or by the early church. So it's important for us as Christians to understand that for that reason. That's one of the reasons why studying church history is important. Another reason why it's important is because it just gives us a better perspective on history. We as Christians, when we study history, we shouldn't study history the same way that non-believers do. We don't see history as just sort of a series of random events that happen. This person did this, or this group did this empire or kingdom came up. No, we see things as we want to be on the lookout for the sovereign hand of God, the providential hand of God guiding history. And church history is no different. Jesus said that the gates of hell would not prevail against the church, and Christ has been building his church for 2,000 plus years. So when we study church history, that's what we're studying. We're studying how it is that God is building his church, how it is that he is expanding his kingdom. Church history, again, is just one of those things that we tend not to be super familiar with. Church history did not start with Grace Community Church here, 40, 50 years ago. It didn't start with Billy Graham 100 years ago. It didn't start with Martin Luther 500 years ago. Again, Christ has been building his church for quite some time. And one of the last big goals or big things that I hope to instill in us is really an appreciation and a respect for many of the difficult doctrinal things that the early church had to wrestle with and had to think through. For example, we can look at something like the doctrine of the Trinity and kind of take it for granted, as if it's just sort of something that's just very plainly given. But as we study it, we'll see that was the product of a lot of thought, a lot of careful thinking, a lot of very systematic thinking as we look at Scripture. Again, we can sort of looking at it in the rear view, we can just kind of think, oh, okay, well, how hard is it to say that, the Father's God, the Son is God, the Spirit's God, yet the Father's not the Son and the Father's not the Spirit. That's not that overly complicated, right? God is one being made up of three persons. That maybe doesn't seem too hard or too complicated, but when you're on the front end, sort of working through that as a first or second or third generation of Christians, I think that as we dive into the study, I think we'll have a greater appreciation for what those within the church did and how they accomplished and worked through a number of these challenging things. So this course, obviously not just tonight, but in general, we're going to be looking at about the time period of 100 to 600 AD. Again, that's a rough estimate. This first lesson tonight isn't even really going to get us to 100 AD. That's just going to build a lot of the sort of framework. We're going to focus on just some of the things that were going on in the world at the time of the apostles, the time of Christ, some of these sort of big picture things that were going on. All right, there's as we study church history, we will go through several different problems we'll get into with church history, and these are things that are just challenges, things that can present difficulty as we study this topic. One of them is we don't, frankly, have as much information as we would like to have. One of the big examples there is that starting in the year 250, going up to about 312 AD, there was a very large and very vast, very strong, intense persecution against the church. And one of the things that Rome sought to do in this persecution was they sought to get rid of all the Christian scriptures. Because of that, many scriptures were burned. And it wasn't just actual copies of New Testament books and things like that. It was really just a lot of Christian writings in general that were written in those first 3 centuries that were destroyed through this persecution. So just as a result of that, the actual evidence there, the actual books that we have and the letters that we have from this person to this person or this church to that church, again, we don't have as much information as we would like to have. And that's one of the difficulties that we have to wrestle with. For example, there's one guy who we only know exists because somebody else mentioned that he existed and he said something about something. So it's one of those things where it's, okay, so here is this early church father who, we think did this and that, but the reality is the only evidence we have for this guy even existing was because somebody else about 100 years mentioned that he existed and that he did something. So again, that is just to show that there are some difficulties as we take on this study. Another difficulty is that there is, to some degree, there is a lack of uniformity. That is, it's sometimes difficult to sort of really buckle down how widespread something was. So one of the early Christian books that we will look at to some degree, I think that's more next week that we'll get into that, but there is a book called the Didache, which basically refers to the teaching of the 12. And it was an early Christian document that was just talking about the Christian life, what do we do, what are our practices. And it's a helpful book. They say a lot about things like baptism and these other things, but the problem is we don't necessarily know how widespread that book was. So it could have been that was a reflection of pretty much everybody in the early church, or it could have been that this was just really something that relates to one particular group that was familiar with that. So that is just another difficulty, is that there is some lack of uniformity. Now, it's not as widespread as many critics of Christianity will claim, but that is a difficulty, is we don't always know how uniform things were. We have what I like to refer to as the Protestant advantage. That is that we are Protestant, which I guess is probably something worth defining at some point, but that is just to say that as Protestants, it's okay for us that church fathers and early church leaders didn't always agree on every point, and that's okay. That's okay. So we are not bound by, for example, as the Roman Catholic Church is, where they have this sort of uniformity that they have to force on all the church, because they have a very, very high view of tradition. And we'll talk more about tradition as we come up. There are some positive and some negative ways we can think about tradition. There's really some different definitions we can look for. But that's one thing that we have as Protestants is it's okay if one person disagrees with another person, and we can respect and love both of them and kind of see where maybe one got it wrong, one got it right, that sort of thing. But really what I'm hoping that we'll accomplish in this first lesson this evening is to understand and see God's work in expanding his people throughout the generations. So as we look through redemptive history, we see there's a couple different places we could start, but for the sake of this, we'll kind of start with Abraham. We see God coming down to Abraham, God condescending and making a covenant with Abraham and saying, you will be my people, your offspring will be my people. We see God coming into Abraham, and then we see him, this covenant that God has with Abraham, God's making Abraham his people. We see that eventually that turns from just this Abraham and his family, this familial thing, we see that turn into really kind of a tribe under Moses. We see it's not just this growing family here. Now this is an entire tribe of people under Moses. We see that tribe sort of mold into a kingdom or a nation under David as we look through, again, redemptive history. And then we see that nation turn into a people when Israel was in exile. And that's kind of the time frame that we're looking at on Sundays in Ezra and Nehemiah, was really when the Jewish people really took on their identity as a people. And then in Christ, we see this go from something that is not just a national thing anymore to now an intranational group. It's not just Jews, which of course, we know that even back then it was not explicitly Jews. It wasn't just about lineage, it was about faith. But we see that really with Christ then go on from being something that's primarily centered in one nation to something going to all the nations there. Sorry, I started at the wrong place on my slides there. All right. And then one other goal that I'll put in there as well is that it's my hope that this study would give us or increase in us a healthy skepticism of novelty, that is, of things that are new. If we look at what the church is today, and if that doesn't look like what the church looked like 1900 years ago, that could be a problem. That's not to say, of course, that everything new is bad and everything old is good, as we will get into. But that is to say that just if it is something that is new, if it is something that does not have a lot behind it, that should give us pause. That should cause us to be somewhat skeptical. Okay, I'm going to look a little bit at just some high points of world history. This is at least somewhat of these things are somewhat familiar to us. But one notable figure, it's tough to kind of look at the Greco-Roman world without thinking about Alexander the Great. So he lived and conquered in the 3rd century before Christ. And really his big thing that he did is he unified the world at the time, or what they, of course, considered the world, which was, certainly much smaller than what we would consider the world today. But really what Alexander brought was he brought a common culture, he brought the Greek culture to it, and he brought the common language, the language of Greek. So that was a huge and a new thing at that time. The known world didn't all speak the same language prior to Alexander. And obviously there were other languages going on there as well. As we get into after the New Testament era, there's a lot of where you have kind of, these people are speaking in Latin maybe and writing in Greek or vice versa or something like that. But Greek being the common language of the people was something that was new. That was something that was not there before. And still at the time of the early church, this is a relatively new thing. The next thing there was a great philosophical advancement. That's usually something that we tend to think about when we think about the Greeks, is we think of philosophy. We think of Aristotle and Plato and these people here. Well, the Greeks accomplished a great deal. And I think one of the things with them, too, is that they got a decent amount of things right. We'll get into some of the things that they got wrong as we get into as we get a little bit further down the road into church history. We'll kind of see some of the erroneous things that they believed that then kind of weaved their way into the church. But there was one historian who summed up the Greek thinkers' accomplishments with this remark. He said, "All of Western philosophy is but a footnote to Plato." In other words, everything that's come since Plato what, 25-ish hundred years ago, 2,300 years ago, something like that. Really, all of Western thought in philosophy is just a footnote to Plato. In other words, he kind of thought of it first, and everything else was just really just kind of maybe tweaking what Plato had done. And I just have that on there just to say that the Greek and Roman world was very accomplished. They were very philosophically accomplished. We also have the establishment of the Roman roads. The Roman roads was a quite interesting thing. It made the world much smaller. There is, I think I have it on the next slide there. Yeah, there's a map here of kind of what Rome would eventually accomplish with the roads there. So that was this was a big accomplishment. And again, it was something that made the world smaller. It was something that beforehand, traveling more than several miles would have been difficult and something that you probably wouldn't have done a whole lot. And then the other thing that really helped with that was something called Pax Romana, which is the Peace of Rome. And that was essentially what a big thing that Rome had brought, or at least thought of themselves as bringing to the known world. And this one really goes along with the Roman roads. It was relative peace that was there. Rome generally thought of themselves as being quite equitable, just in their dealings with people, in their rulings. There was a good amount of police force, essentially, making things like travel safe. So even without the roads, like you could have roads, but if travel's not safe and everywhere is covered in, bandits and raiders and things like that, you're still not going to travel. But these two things kind of worked hand in hand. The peace of Rome, this era of peace, which would have started shortly before the New Testament era there, going up until 180 AD. So this was just important things to think about. And kind of one other thing that I think is interesting as we look at these is, and this is, I guess, just kind of speculation, but something that I've often thought about is why did Christ come when Christ came? In other words, why did he come 2,000 years ago instead of 5,000 years ago, or instead of 500 years ago, or something like that? And I think a lot of these things are really, as we look at God's providence, I think they kind of answer that. And again, that's somewhat speculative, but as we look at this here, we see with philosophy, really the Greek philosophers had gone as far as you can go, really, without some kind of a divine revelation. They had thought of a number of things. We have a common language here. Again, if Christ had come, several hundred years before, that would have really changed things in terms of the language. Christ came and the New Testament went out at a time when people were speaking the same language, at a time when there were roads that people could travel and people could spread the gospel and churches could be established all across the region. Same thing with the peace of Rome. There was relative peace so that the apostles could go out and bring the gospel to the world. That's, again, somewhat of a hypothesis on my part, but I think it's interesting to see the way that God works through human history. Something I think could be said similar to around the era of the Reformation and the invention of the printing press. I think that was another thing where God is just, he's guiding things. God is providentially guiding things. Let's see, there's the roads there. Let's look at just some of the New Testament history here. This is just kind of looking at the timeline of things here. Okay, so we are probably quite familiar with the first one here. People somewhat debate on which actual year Christ was born, but generally speaking, we'll refer to that as 4 BC. So we have, again, right at the turn of the century there, really the start of the century, essentially. We have the crucifixion of Christ there. Again, that's somewhat debated. Obviously, our time frame here, we believe Jesus was about 33 when he was crucified, but 33 AD for the crucifixion of Christ. That is in Luke 23. we have Pentecost in Acts 2. Pentecost being when the Spirit of God came down and empowered the church in a way that really in a new way, but also kind of in an old way. And one thing that I want to put under that is the reversal of the Babel event. So if you remember all the way back in Genesis chapter 11. Yeah, can I have somebody read Genesis 11? Awesome, thank you. So it's very interesting here, and there's I think there's a number of additional things going on in that passage at the time of Babel. We don't have time tonight to unpack the whole thing, but what I think is especially important to note there is that you have, in the Babel event, you have people working together, people speaking the same language, and essentially what they were doing is they were building a ziggurat. It was a temple of pagan worship, essentially. They were not doing what God had commanded them. So God then comes down in judgment and divides their languages. They had a common language. God divided their languages, dispersing the peoples. And what's very interesting there is God essentially disinherits them. In other words, he says, okay, you're not going to be part of what I'm doing anymore, essentially because of this event. So God is coming down and he is dispersing them, he is judging them through dividing their languages. And then I don't remember if it's in the next or the 2 chapters later, but then is when God comes down to Abraham and he says, okay, I'm going to make you my people. I'm going to make a nation out of you. So what we have here is we have this dramatic judgment event, this very negative event. And then we have, in Acts chapter 2, we have Pentecost, where the Holy Spirit comes down, and as the language reads, it says tongues of fire were over them. And then God is then using these men to speak the gospel in other languages. He's essentially reversing what he's done at Babel here. Whereas in Babel, he came down and divided the languages to judge and disinherit the people. In the book of Acts, he is now coming down not as an act of judgment, but as an act of grace. And he is dividing the languages so that people can hear the gospel in their own native tongues. This is a huge event here. I love it when, especially in the New Testament, there's so many big reversals like that. I love seeing that. And this is really what kicks off what we would refer to as the New Testament church, is this Pentecost event, where a number of souls are saved, a number of thousands of souls are saved. And we see the church in the next few chapters of Acts just grow and grow and grow. More and more people hear the gospel. They turn to Christ. They are added to the church. And then we see, starting in Acts chapter 8, that is the story of Stephen. Stephen, this early deacon who was a gifted preacher who was killed by essentially it was the angry Jews, the angry Jewish leaders. They were going after him because he was essentially attacking what they held to be sacred. He was preaching the gospel, but they did not like that presentation. And of course, this is where the Apostle Paul comes in, not as an apostle yet, but Paul comes in as a persecutor of the church before he ended up joining and leading in many ways the church. So this is in Acts chapter 8 is when this first persecution starts. This is a persecution, again, from the Jews. There are a number of persecutions that we'll get into as we study church history. Typically, they'll come from the Romans, but this one comes from the Jews. This is the one that's kind of in view. I know a number of you are studying or have been studying the book of James when it's addressed to those in the dispersia. Those who have been dispersed. There was the persecution, so people would kind of flee. So that's kind of what's going on there. And then we see in Acts chapter 11, we really see this gospel focus shift from the Jews to the Gentiles. From the Jews to the Gentiles. And that's where we see the first large groups of Gentiles being saved. We see them receiving the Holy Spirit the same way that the Jews, the first Christians, received the Spirit of God. And really the focus there from really the rest of Acts, which really Acts covers that at least those next couple decades of church history, that's really what we're looking at, is we're looking at the gospel go out to the Gentiles. All right, so that's kind of in a nutshell what we know about this ancient period from the church. That was kind of what that last thing was to get, kind of to highlight those points that are in the New Testament. That is, sorry, not the church, in the New Testament regarding the early state of the church. We're going to shift a little bit to some of the extra biblical accounts of what was going on at those times. The first one is the martyrdom of the apostles. For the most part, that is not recorded in the New Testament. But to give a list, and this is, again, not according to the Bible, but just according to church tradition, or in other words, people witnessing, seeing of, hearing of these events, but just a brief summary to look at what became of the apostles. Thomas brought the gospel to India, where he was speared to death. Andrew traveled to Turkey and to Greece and was crucified. Philip went to North Africa. He converted the wife of the proconsul and in retaliation was executed. Matthew died bringing the gospel to Ethiopia, possibly stabbed to death. James was stoned or clubbed to death in Syria. Simon went to Persia. He was killed for refusing to sacrifice to idols. Matthias, who was the one who replaced Judas Iscariot, was burned in Syria. Peter and Paul were both killed in Rome, beheaded, and Paul was beheaded. Peter was crucified upside down. The only apostle not to be martyred for their faith was the apostle John, who was boiled alive in oil and then exiled to the island of Patmos, where he wrote Revelation. There was one church father that we'll learn more about in probably 2 weeks by the name of Tertullian, who said, speaking of the apostles, he said, the blood of the martyr is the seed of the church. In other words, we're seeing God's gospel plan being fulfilled through the suffering of his people, in this case, the apostles. And we see just incredible fruit from this. All these places where the apostles brought the gospel to, we see churches start to sprout and start to blossom there. As Paul says in Colossians 1:6, he says the gospel is bearing fruit and growing throughout the whole world. So even in Paul's life, he was able to look out and see the church growing. Let's see, one very important figure as we look at church history, not important in a good way, but that is Emperor Nero. Emperor Nero. I suspect a number of us have at least heard the name of Nero. He was a very uniquely wicked ruler. He launched the first persecution of the church starting during the AD 60s, was when that began. He became an emperor as a teenager. He was a vandal. He was, like I said, he was uniquely wicked. He had his mother and his wife assassinated. He fancied himself a bit of an entertainer. He would require people to sit down and listen to him give speeches and presentations. And there's a number of stories of various acts of depravity that Nero partake in. But really the thing that kicked off the persecution of the Christians was in the year 64, there was a great fire that started, and pretty much Rome, much of Rome anyway, burned to the ground. And right after the fire stopped, Nero presented plans to build a new Rome. And people quickly became suspicious of him, thinking that he was probably the one who started the fire to then kind of get his building project in there. But in a political move, he turned and blamed this new sect of Jews called the Christians. And obviously, we would not see ourselves as a sect of Jews, but that was how people thought of Christians then. And this is again what began the Roman persecution. This is likely it was in this time frame that Peter and Paul were martyred. Nero eventually became paranoid, became erratic, found out that there was a plan to assassinate him. He eventually died by his own hand 4 years later in AD 68. He's considered by many, if you've studied sort of the different views of eschatology or end times, he's considered by many to be the beast of Revelation. If you're familiar with Revelation, it speaks of the beast sort of in a couple different contexts. In some contexts, it's as an individual. In other contexts, it's sort of as a nation, which has led many to believe that Nero is actually the singular beast of Revelation, and then the plural beast would then be just the Roman Empire as a whole. That's by no means the universal understanding of the church, but there is quite a bit of evidence that would seem to support that particular position. It's an interesting study. And then the last, I guess this is probably going to be the last big event that we will get to here is AD 70. AD 70. AD 70 is something that there were... a very catastrophic event in AD 70 that really marked the end of what we would consider the Jewish age. Let's see, so backing up a couple years leading up to AD 70, so we have the year 64, there was all kinds of civil wars that happened in Jerusalem. There was infighting among various Jewish warlords and things like that. There was a great famine that then happened on top of that. There was, between these various warlords, these different sects of Jews that were opposed to each other, they would sneak in and destroy each other's food supply and things like that, and that's especially devastating in a time of a famine. So that was starting in AD 67. The next year was the year that Nero died. That's known as the year of 4 emperors. Nero was succeeded by 3 different emperors in AD 68, which was quite uncommon for Rome. Rome, up until that point, typically when they had emperors or leaders, they would be there for a long time. It wasn't this typical, one after another type thing, but that was just to say that there was much political turmoil at that time there. Again, that was the year of 4 emperors. The last of those emperors is Vespasian. You may have heard his name, but his son Titus, he and his son Titus were both leaders in the Roman army. And Titus went to mobilize an army to stabilize the region of Palestine, to calm down the chaos that was happening in Jerusalem. In AD 68 or 69, Vespasian left to go become the emperor as there was that rapid succession there, and left his son Titus to finish the job of securing Jerusalem. In the spring, there was an influx of Jews who came to visit Jerusalem anyway, despite the chaos that was happening. They would visit there for the time of Passover. Passover was a time where the city was packed. And in that time, Titus then surrounded and sieged the city. Typically in a siege, one of the things that you'll do is you'll attempt to just surround the city in order to starve it out. In other words, people are a lot easier to conquer when they are nearly dead. So they already didn't have food, and then they were put under siege. There was already this famine, and then the siege came. and Titus eventually conquered the city. What's interesting is that at that time, as the city was surrounded, there are several, or at least one church father that notes that at the time when the city was surrounded, the Christians left. The Christians left Judea, which is quite interesting. Typically, conventional wisdom would say, no, go to the city, hide in the city is going to be the safer place, but the Christians ran to the hills. That was Eusebius, who we'll hear more about later, noted that. So the Christians, by and large, got out before the worst thing came there. There was fighting for weeks. The Jews held fairly strong. There was a 10-week period where Rome sieged the city. And in that time, eventually Rome would be successful and come through and conquer the city. But in that time, there are just tales of just the most horrific, barbarous things. Is barbarous even a word? I don't know. Barbarous things that would take place there. As you can imagine, when people have not had food for months and there's fighting and things like that, there's tales of mothers cannibalizing their young, of people just tearing one another limb from limb, trying to eat the food that person had maybe consumed hours before. Just absolutely horrible piece of history. I would say that's as bad and as blood-curdling as any modern event that we can think of. In the month of August, the temple caught fire and the temple was destroyed. Josephus, who was a Jewish historian, he was actually a general on the side of the Jews in this conflict. He was someone who was spared by Rome and ended up writing much of the history that we have on this particular subject. If you're familiar with any of the writers in this era, Josephus is a name that's going to come up a lot. But he's the one who records that. He recorded the streets looking like rivers of blood at that time. And what's interesting he records too is that he records Titus, who was the general who come in, who said something to the effect, when he came in and saw the conquered city, he said, it was not us, but a God who did this, which is quite interesting from a hardened Roman military leader, that he came and looked upon that destruction and he said, I didn't do that. Oh man, we're getting low on time, aren't we? What's interesting, okay, so here's some homework for tonight too. Go home and read Matthew chapter 24. And I'll just highlight a couple things there, but it's very interesting how the words of Christ in Matthew 24 is Jesus sort of laying out his woe to this generation and that, and he's being asked, okay, what are these signs that we should look for? The apostles ask him. It's very interesting how much the account of Jesus in Matthew 24 matches the events recorded in AD 70. And it's interesting because Jesus precisely predicted what was going to happen. If you recall, Jesus looked at the temple and said, this generation will not pass away until this temple is utterly destroyed. And what happened 40 years later? The temple was utterly destroyed. That's a huge piece, I think, of just great apologetic value to the Christian, is this that happened here, even down to the time frame, is quite interesting. And there's similar judgment language that we can find. Matthew 24 has a lot of that judgment language, speaking of the sun being darkened and the stars falling from the sky and things like that. Things that we, I think, a lot of times are tempted to take overly literally, but that's just common judgment language in Scripture. You can also see it in like Isaiah 13 through 30. There's a lot of that language when God is judging this country or this nation or that kind of thing. It's this similar language. It's just, I think this really points to a great covenantal judgment. If you're familiar with, Parker's not here tonight, but last week he talked on covenant. And one of the things with covenant is there's covenantal blessings and there's covenantal curses or covenantal judgments. And again, these events of AD 70 match pretty much perfectly with the covenantal curses that God gave to Israel. This is really God, I think, sort of punctuating this end of this Jewish age. Not, of course, to say that God has abandoned Israel or something like that, but on a national level, certainly we can see this big changing focus here. Let's see, I'll wrap up here in just a sec. Again, I think it's one of the things that I really want to drive home as we get into this is that as we are studying church history, we are not just studying brute facts. We don't study these events as a non-believer studies these facts. We see this as a theological study. This is an outworking of Scripture. This is an outworking of Psalm 110, which I think I have on my... Oh, there's a image of... Looks like it's out of Lord of the Rings or something, but of Jerusalem under siege and being burned and destroyed. But again, I want us to see as we study this, I want us to see this as an outworking of things that God has done. God has done. We see, as we look at all of human history, we see creation in Genesis 1. We see the fall in Genesis 3, where things are plunged into sin and death. We see, again, the Babel event in Genesis 11 there, where God is disinheriting and judging the nations. And then we see this promise for future salvation for the nations. It's sort of shadowed in Genesis 12. Again, I was hoping we'd have time to read through these. Maybe we can read through some of them as we dismiss the kids for their brief lesson. But Isaiah 56 is one of those really clear places where God just gives hope to these disinherited nations. And then we see this expansion of the people of God where it's initially just a man. It's just Abraham, and then it's Abraham's family, and then it's this tribe of Moses, and then it's this kingdom of David, and then it's this people, the Jews. And then into the New Testament era, God's people is not just limited to that, but it is a people made up of every tribe and tongue. And this is then the outworking of the church. So this is then the foundation that we look at when we study church history. We see this is Psalm 110, verse 1. That's the most common or most quoted book, or most quoted verse in the Bible. It says, "The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool." And again, as we study church history, this is what we are going to see. This is the way that God is conquering the nations. This is the way he is building his kingdom. All right. Let's dismiss the littles. They have a brief lesson here. And then, we can now have some discussion time. And this will be fairly quick here. But we'll have some discussion time and then do some prayer requests and that. Ryan, what you got? It is, it's wild to see that consistency through there, yeah. Yep. All right. So I know, like I said, we didn't even really get into what we typically think of as church history in this first lesson. Really this is looking at, again, really just kind of laying the foundation, laying the framework for the things that we will learn about in weeks to come. But one of the things that I want you to do, obviously, feel free to ask questions. But if you have any questions that you want a more in-depth answer to, like, be thinking of those and then come with those, and I'll might answer them on the spot or might address them at later times. When we get into church history, it's kind of interesting. I think really just studying history in general is kind of interesting because there's the one approach of just, okay, we're going to go from the timelines, right? So that's one way to do it. It's just, okay, this is first century, here's all the stuff that's happened. Okay, now we have the second century, here's all the stuff that happened, here's the people. But then there's also sort of that... the tracing the different thoughts. So for example, as we get into understanding God as being triune, that's not something we're going to do just in one century because that thought kind of developed throughout several centuries. And it's interesting to kind of glean that insight from different people. Or the atonement would be another one. What did Christians think about the atonement? Where did we get the idea that we would affirm today as being the most full theory of the atonement, which is penal substitution. In other words, Christ died in our place as a substitute suffering our penalty. Okay, well, where did that idea come from? How did the early church fathers think about that? And, again, that's something that we're not going to uncover just looking at one century. We're going to have to kind of piece together, these different timelines. So we'll do some of that as we move forward. But any questions on anything from tonight's study at this point? This was also kind of an interesting time period because this was really within 100 years or so, less than that really, of when Rome transitioned from being a republic to being an empire. Augustus is typically thought of as really that kind of point of transition, but I mean that was only decades before Nero was there. So that was kind of when that transition started, when Rome turned into an empire. But yes, that's interesting, and we'll get into. We won't spend a ton of time on a lot of the different Caesars and that kind of thing, the different rulers. One of the big ones that we'll talk about is Emperor Constantine. He came a couple hundred years later. He was the first Christian emperor of Rome. So that was a really Christianity would never be the same once Constantine took the throne there. But yeah. I think in some way or another, the Beast of Revelation is related to Nero. And really what Josh is getting at is if you study the book of Revelation, there's scholars will debate on whether it was written in the 60s or whether it was written in the 90s AD. There's more evidence, I would say, that it was written in the 90s than in the 60s. That's probably the position that I would take. So yeah, it would almost be like if it's written in the 90s, it's maybe using some of what Nero did as imagery. If it was written in the 60s, that's really a very different way to understand Revelation. That sees Revelation as history that was fulfilled in the first century rather than, oh man, what have you done, Josh? I was going to say, yeah, when you get to Revelation, there's a few different ways that you can read it. You can read it, that would be like the preterist interpretation, which would see most of what happened in the book of Revelation as being things that happened within the first century. So then, if you're a preterist and you're reading Revelation as a Christian today, you're not reading that as if it's some future event or not some idealistic thing sort of spanning all of time. You're seeing it primarily as history. The most popular view today would be the futurist view that would see it as, if you're familiar with Left Behind, which that is not the position we take as a church that sees it as sort of future events that are going to unfold. That's probably the most common view amongst Christians today. We would probably, and we don't have an official position on the book of Revelation, but we would probably take a more idealist approach to it and see it as sort of an unfolding spiritual reality of the church and of Christ's victory over death and the devil and things like that. But that's fun history to look at, was it written in the 60s or in the 90s? And okay, how do you then interpret it differently if it was written in one versus the other? But that's, again, more than we'll get into in week one of church history. Yeah, so I guess that could refer to, there's some allusions to the fact that John would not die. He would see Christ returning in power. So kind of some of that question gets into the judgment of Israel in AD 70. Again, there's a few different ways you can look at, like Matthew 24 and that fulfillment. Some people, I would say many would see that they would see Christ's kingdom and coming in power as being a judgment in AD 70. So, for example, there's a number of prophetic passages that talk about God riding on a swift cloud of judgment coming to Egypt, for example, in Isaiah. So they would say that that's kind of what they're likening that to, is Christ coming down riding in a cloud of judgment as he's judging Israel in AD 70. So yeah, that would be one understanding. I think I would probably lean more towards the view of Pentecost there being, okay, this is when there's a new era of the Spirit being poured out, of the gospel going out, the disciples going out. Yeah, I would probably lean towards that. But yeah, I probably wouldn't take a hard stance one way or the other. All right, any other questions?